Okay, so with the start of a new year, people are going to start looking back at the previous year. What have they accomplished? What happened? What changed? So what we're going to be doing here instead is look at a class as a whole. We're going to be going video by video, class by class, and look at how have they previously performed coming into Shadowlands, and then how are they currently doing in Shadowlands. Rather than making, these videos about looking at healers and tanks and DPS and just looking at all of them at once, we can do something a little bit more in-depth class by class. We can look at how were they doing, for example, in BFA, how they progressed throughout BFA, and how were they looking to be coming into Shadowlands. So have they went and gone way better than expected, way worse than expected? Have they gone completely unrecognized because nobody cared about them in the first place? How was their state before coming into Shadowlands? Have they improved, even if just in playstyle, in the way the spec works? Is it more enjoyable now? All these series of things is what we're going to be looking at in this video, and we're starting with Druid. Why are we starting with Druid? Well, number one, I don't have to answer to you. And number two, this is what my team of scientists gave me. Apparently the reason is that Druid is the one with 4 specs. So we're getting rid of the biggest class first. The class with 4 specs, although often people can only mention 2. Not a surprise, we're going to be seeing exactly why. So let's go and start looking at how Druid has developed over time into Shadowlands, starting with tank. So we're starting with Guardian Druid. So when it comes to raids, now I'm going to show you just the first patch of the raid, which is the patch where, progression starts and continues, is the biggest part of the progress. It doesn't matter if, 3 patches later, a lot of things changed. That's just farm, doesn't really matter to progression, which is where you want to be popular, not later, not 6 months later. So we can see that Guardian Druid, ever since Uldir, the first raid, they were the least popular spec, even losing to Vengeance Demon Hunter. You go into BOD and Druid gets a massive win in being able to overtake Vengeance Demon Hunter. You go into Eternal Palace and all the Druids rejoice because they managed to stay ahead of Vengeance, and then at the last tier in Nyalotha, big disappointment because Druid dropped even lower down. This was when scaling with things like corruptions was making Vengeance much better than Guardian. Still not very good in comparison to other tanks, but Guardian Druid was left definitely on the side. When we look at the current state of things, when we look at Castonatria, we see that the situation is just about the same. In Castonatria, this time it's Protection that has dropped off the face of the earth, and Guardian Druid is second last. When we go and look at Mythic Plus for Druid, so when you are that unpopular in raids, something has to change a lot in Mythic Plus, in the way your spec works for you to be very popular, right? In BFA, from Season 1, which is Uldir, and then Season 2, which is BOD, Season 3, which is Eternal Palace, and then Season 4, the last season, which is Nyalotha, at the start, in the 10 to 14 range, which is the most popular range for the player base, for most of the player base, Druid was at the bottom. Throughout, in fact, all of the seasons, Druid have basically been at the bottom except for one. We can see that in Season 1 they were at the bottom, in Season 2 they were still at the bottom by quite a bit, by almost 30%, below both Vengeance and Brewmaster. In Season 3 they were still at the bottom, and in Season 4, as I mentioned, Corruptions played a joke on them, as well as Brewmaster Monks in Mythic Plus, and other specs, pretty much all the other specs got higher, except for Guardian, which just stayed there. When you start looking at higher keys, so this is a more competitive zone, well, yeah, in Season 1, it was really bad for Guardian Druid. It got a little bit better in Season 2. This was thanks to the Vengeance Demon Hunter getting outscaled a little bit and dropping a lot in popularity. In Season 3, at 15 and up, Guardian Druid was still doing pretty badly, and it was still the lowest tank in Mythic Plus. And the last season, similar to the 10 to 14 range, Guardian Druid was still not very popular, but being in the 10 to 15% range is actually just fine for a tank. With 6 tank specs available, if you are in the 15% range, it almost makes it so that 1 out of 6 runs you have a Druid, so it's not that bad. And the situation didn't change much for the absolute top, the plus 20 up keys, where Guardian Druid went from the 3% of Season 2, the 7% of Season 3, and the 11% of Season 4, again, still at the bottom. How is it faring today, though? Well, today there is a change. Unsurprisingly, just like raids. Protection Warrior now is at the bottom, and then there is Guardian Druid. The difference is that now they are fighting a little bit more head-to-head with the middle of the pack, which is Brewmaster and Blood DK. There is Protection Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter currently staying ahead because of their heavy damage. Vengeance also has the slight advantage of being a little bit more tanky, also directly related to their damage. And the situation becomes similar, but even more skewed in favor of Vengeance when you look at plus 15 and up keys. So the much higher keys, you can see the logs are much lower. There isn't even 10,000 logs of 15 and up keys, and Guardian Druid is in the same situation. Still higher than Protection Warrior, and still fighting in the middle of the pack, this time with DK and Protection Paladin, and then much lower than both Brewmaster and Vengeance. Protection Paladin takes a big drop at higher keys in favor of Brewmaster due to the extra defensiveness of Brewmaster compared to the squishiness of Protection Paladin in comparison. So we can see that from an expansion to the next, it hasn't really changed much for Guardian Druid. The difference in placement, we can say, is basically just because Protection Warrior died. If Protection Warrior had performed, not even like in BFA, because that was terribly overtuned, but even just half of what they did in BFA, then Guardian Druid would be taking its place, essentially. Now, here's the interesting question related to Guardian Druid. How much of this has to do with the community perception of it being weak, and how much of it has to do with outside forces beyond their control? For example, when you look at raids, for example, Mistweaver Monk is not doing very well, and Windwalker Monk, which we will see, is actually doing very well. It is very surprising. Nobody expected it. It is still very unpopular and not very played. So you do want the physical damage buff in your raid, and the safest pick is a Brewmaster tank. When you look at Demon Hunters, Havoc is doing very badly, and you still do want a Demon Hunter debuff in your raid. So you want to pick a Vengeance tank. So how much of, for example, their performance in raids, or rather the popularity in raids, has to do with the fact that tank is an easy place to slot your buffs or your debuffs, meaning Guardian Druid simply gets left out of simply not having anything to bring. Even at Blood Death Knight is more useful because of Anti-Magic Zone being a baseline ability for DKs now. We see that in Mythic Plus it is getting slightly better, but again, how much of it has to do with other specs, for example, doing more damage, like Vengeance and Protection Paladin. Even Brewmaster Monk, which has gained way more popularity in 15 and higher keys for defensiveness. Ideally, technically, Guardian Druid can also be as defensive, and yet it remains very unpopular. So why do you think it is? Is it their mobility? Is it their lack of damage? Is it their reliance on their cooldowns, like Incarnation? That's an interesting question, of which I will not take the responsibility to answer. I will just leave it all to you and say nothing. Now, looking at another spec that is in a similar situation is Feral. So we're looking at melee DPS now. So in case you're new to Feral and to melee DPS because you never cared about melee DPS, Feral is very unpopular. Is it Survival Hunter tier? No, it's not, but still unpopular. So when the expansion started in BFA, we see that in Uldir, the first tier, yeah, that's where Feral is. Feral is at the absolute bottom, and temporarily they are also losing to Survival, yeah. When it came to the DPS, they were still doing better than a few specs, particularly against their, competition, the melee. They were still doing better than both Windwalker and Enhancement, but still very bottom, very low in representation and in performance. When you go up to BOD, BOD is when, Blizzard started adding more Azerite rates, another DPS Azerite ring for you to do better. Some of the specs gained massive benefits from this, like Elemental Shaman, like Protection Warrior, but Feral improved a little bit, or rather other specs got worse, we should say, mostly the DKs. So Feral still outperformed Windwalker and Enhancement. One of the rogue specs, Subtlety, fell into oblivion after the stint on Zul in Uldir. They went back at being very bad. But beyond those specs, Feral didn't improve that much. When you look at the popularity of BOD, Feral was still at the bottom. Yes, hooray, they beat Survival, but all the other melee specs, even specs, as I mentioned, like the DK specs doing worse, they were still more popular. We move over to Eternal Palace when Essences come into play. That's another chance for specs to just have a big turnaround, change their expansion, do a 180, get OP Essences that shape your spec and do much better. When it comes to Feral, similar bottom half of the DPS in terms of performance, still doing better than quite a few melee DPS specs, but just not enough. Both warrior specs were far ahead. Havoc Demon Hunter was of course doing much better. You had at least one rogue spec above you, which is all that matters. And when it comes to popularity of Eternal Palace, again, Feral was towards the bottom. It doesn't really matter, again, this is very important when it comes to popularity. It doesn't really matter if Feral is doing better than Arms, because Arms can still go and play Fury. it doesn't matter if Feral is doing better than Subtlety because they can go and play Assassination, or if it's beating Arcane and Demonology, when Fire and Affliction are doing much better. Same for Marksmanship and Beast Mastery. So pretty much the only spec, roll for roll, that Feral was doing better off in terms of popularity was just Survival Hunter. We move on to the last tier of the expansion, and did anything change? Yeah, Feral technically continued to just do a little bit better over time, very slowly, in terms of performance. This time they're actually in the dead middle, slightly creeping in the upper half actually, for the first time in the expansion. Did anything change to their popularity? Did this actually, improve their player base? No, it didn't. Pretty much similar, if not exactly the same as the previous tier. Just slightly above in popularity as the lowest other specs, which could just all jump ship to the more popular spec. Arms, Demonology, Marksmanship, Subtlety, and Arcane could all go and play Beast Mastery, Fury, Destruction, Fire, and Assassination. So again, the only relevant spec Feral was more popular of was Survival. If we look at Mythic Plus, the situation has been the same for Feral. They started Season 1 in the 10 to 14 range at 1.7% representation, going to 2.9, 3.2, and 3.7. When you look at the 15 and up, they started even worse at 0.7 and then 2%, 2.3, and 3.8. When you look at the 20 and up, which is relevant in BFA because keys went higher than 30 even, Feral was at 1.2, 1.3, and 3%. So they have gotten a slight rise over time. But how does it compare to the current Feral, to what Feral is doing now? Well, the 10 to 14 range, which is the, 90% of everyone getting past 10 doing right now, is at 2.9%. So in line with the previous expansions, in line with the previous seasons, beating just Survival and the least played specs of the other classes like Rogue and Death Knight, but not much else. If you look at 15 and up, 1.7. It goes even lower than before. So not really anything changed for Feral. The only change we can see though, the only change that is relevant to mention between BFA and now is that Feral currently in Castelnatria is here. It's top, it's top 6. Now, Feral has never been this high. Feral has always gotten this meme that theoretically on paper they had one of the highest single target DPS, but it never really showed up in actual practice. Now though, they are doing much better. I already made a little video where I mentioned the power that Feral gets extra when they get Convoke the Spirits, and this is the result. They are doing much better. When it comes to popularity though, it is similar to other seasons. They are basically at the bottom with all the other specs that are not being played because those classes have other options. Frost and Arcane are beaten by Feral, but that's because everyone is playing Fire. Destruction and Demonology are beaten by Feral, but that's because everyone is playing Affliction. Frost DK, I'm not even gonna mention. And then Assassination Rogue, again beaten because Outlaw and Subtlety are more popular. So again, Feral is in a situation where they're basically just beating Survival and nobody else. So we have gotten by now a full expansion, BFA, and the first tier of the new expansion, Shadowlands, where Feral Druid in raids is basically always consistently at the bottom with Survival Hunter. When you look at other classes, the options that other classes have. And when it comes to Mythic Plus, they are still losing to pretty much every other class, only ever beating the specs that have been eaten by the more popular one, like Frost DK being murdered by Unholy DK, Survival Hunter, it's just always dead. You have right now Assassination Rogue being killed by the other two Rogue specs, etc, etc. In Mythic Plus, it is likely even worse than raids because, again, single target loses a lot of value in Mythic Plus. Even on Tyrannical weeks, getting faster packs, getting faster to thrash is still pretty relevant. Pure single target specs that do a little bit worse in AoE suffer a little bit more. Feral takes quite a bit to ramp up. And then when you want to go really in detail, there is still the problem. There is still the problem that Feral brings no buffs, Feral brings no debuffs, and Feral brings no immunity. So they are in this little hole where their utility is pretty lacking, despite being a druid with 50 fucking buttons for utility. The real strong utility, things like Arcane Intellect, things like a Rallying Cry, things like a Cheat Death, is what they are lacking. So I don't think that it is going to get much better if the DPS continues to stay on this scale for raids, for example. When you pit them up against Unholy DKs still have Anti-Magic Zone. And if you want to go even more in detail, if you pit them against Arms Warrior, for example, Arms Warriors still have Battle Shout and Rallying Cry and the strongest execute in the game when they are Ventir. So it doesn't look too good, in my opinion, for Feral Druid. It's just about their toolkit, not about their damage. So even if they improve in their damage, I think they need some other things in their toolkit to become more popular and as a result, more relevant. Now, on to the two actually used, actually popular, and actually considered by the community as viable specs most of the time. We start with balance. It is interesting to talk about balance because they are actually in an interesting situation. When we look at Uldir, they were very popular. As you can see, the most popular range spec together with Beast Mastery Hunter. When you look at their actual performance, it wasn't even that crazy. They were beaten by a few other specs, but they remained very popular. When you go into the next tier, which is Battle of the Zara Lore, this time it's even better. This time their popularity skyrockets even more. BOD, towards the end of BOD, is when Beast Mastery was starting to get outscaled. So marksmanship, which was previously at the very bottom when Beast Mastery was popular, has started rising up, and as a result, Beast Mastery dropped. So Balanced Druid stayed clear at the top. When it came to damage, again, Balanced Druid was a solid top pick for BOD. You go into Eternal Palace, and this time Beast Mastery gets giga buffed again and will continue to scale out of control until the end of the expansion. So Balance is the second most represented range spec in Eternal Palace, and when it comes to performance, they are even worse than before. And yet, they are still used a lot. The last tier of the expansion is going to be Nyalota. This is where all the corruption fuckery comes in, and we can see that their popularity gets beaten by a few specs that scale out of control. I mentioned Beast Mastery. Look at the amount of logs of Beast Mastery compared to marksmanship and compared to everyone else. It's insane. Of course, Fire Mage scales out of control, as well as Destruction Warlock. And Balance suffers a little bit. In fact, it suffers quite a bit more than, it would appear when you look at the performance. Balanced Druid was actually pretty weak in Nyalota. The only reason why it stayed that popular is because they have been popular for the entire expansion, and Balanced Druid does not have a backup plan. They can't just say, oh, balance sucks, I'm gonna go feral. It doesn't work like that when you want to go from range to melee, so they were stuck on balance, and this was the result. Their performance was much weaker in Nyalota, but their popularity stayed very high. When you look at the popularity in Mythic Plus, it is pretty much the same as raids. They started BFA in the very first season as one of the most represented range specs together with Mage and Hunter. No surprise there. Season 2, Season 3, and Season 4 follows the same pattern that raids have followed. The scaling of corruptions and the synergy you add with essences, Druid wasn't that good with. BM Hunters were very good, Fire Mages were very good, Destro Locks were very good, Balanced Druid not that much, which is why over time their popularity wanes in Mythic Plus. You can go at even higher keys, 15 and up. They start again together with Mage and Hunter very high, and then in Season 2, Season 3, and Season 4, they drop much lower to 12% at the end of Season 4, at the end of Nyalota. And when you look at 20 and up, the highest, the competitivest tier of Mythic Plus, again, they start very popular in Season 2 at the highest keys. This time the only exception here is Elemental, because in Season 2, in BOD, Elemental was very powerful. In Season 3, they are even more powerful than before, but then in Season 4, you get the massive drop, again, because of their scaling. How are they doing now, though, compared to the last expansion? You could have been worried if you were a Balanced Druid ending BFA, considering the downward trend of balance at the end of BFA, right? Well, they are still doing almost exactly as the last expansion, with the only difference that this time Shadow Priest is more popular than before. So they are still actually the second most represented spec in 10 to 14 keys, below Marksmanship Hunter, and when you look at the higher keys, the 15 and up, they only start losing a little bit more to Fire Mage, but they are still a solid third pick for your range DPS spec. And then when it comes to the current day of raids instead of Mythic Plus, we see that there is a similar pattern as the previous expansions. The best Mage spec and the best Warlock spec together with the best Hunter spec are going to be fighting Balance. This is where Balance is right now, the fourth most represented range spec. And when you look at the actual damage, you can see that it's also the third highest damage dealing spec below Affliction and Fire Mage. So I guess the question we can pose ourselves when it comes to Druid is how exactly have they remained so popular? We have seen that throughout several tiers, they weren't even doing that well in damage. They weren't that special. Yet, their popularity stayed very high, unreasonably high, given what they were bringing to the raid. Because that's the problem, right? This type of excuse can be made for a warrior because they have a crucial part of a raid kit that you want, which is Battle Shout. Even more, in depth, you might even want to keep a warrior just because of, number one, Rallying Cry, as an actual external cooldown for your raid, and number 2, their execute damage. It doesn't matter if they show low in their total global rankings when their execute damage is the strongest, and it can happen that the hardest part of a fight is the execute phase. Same can be said for mages being bad whenever that ever happened in the history of WoW, but even then they still have the intellect buff and they can still bring an immunity. When you look at balance, what do they bring? Combat rest isn't really a thing. Many other specs are going to have it in the raid. When you look at things like movement, their stampeding roar is worse than Windrush Totem in like every single scenario. And even then, as we know, Restoration Shaman has been, a main pick for raids since forever. So that's not even something you would want necessarily. They have no immunity, they have no cheese, they have no cheats. Their mobility is actually very poor. Whenever there is a pure single target fight, whenever they don't spec and tune themselves for AoE when they can move on the run inside Starfall. So that would be my question to you. Why do they seem to be a spec that has always remained popular? Despite the fact that they never had backup plans as a class, they never had the same luxury as specs like Warlocks and Mages and Hunters and Rogues of constantly changing their spec to the strongest one. I'm curious to see what your theory is on this. Now for the last spec of the class, we have Restoration Druid. So Restoration Druid is also an interesting spec because they are the best of the worst healers in raids. The best healers are the healers that bring damage reduction, so Restoration Shaman, Discipline Priest and Holy Paladin, and then the best of the other three, Holy Priest, Mistweaver and Restoration Druid, is Druid. Because on top of bringing very high throughput as the other two specs, they also have very strong cooldowns, as well as the ability to move and heal at the same time with their heal over time. They're just more tuned for raids than the other two specs. So when we start in Uldir, what a nostalgic chart. We have Mistweaver Monk as the more popular spec, and Restoration Druid is instead towards the bottom. But then again, the parses were very close to each other. Just 28,000 parses for Resto Shaman and 25.9 for Restoration Druid, so very, very close. When we go into BOD, again, Restoration Druid is the fourth healer, much closer to Holy Priest than before. When we go into Eternal Palace, we have Restoration Druid taking a massive jump compared to other specs, Mistweaver dropping even more down towards the bottom. And finally, at the end, for Nyalotha, we do have Restoration Druid at the third spot. Now, it has been the more common composition throughout the expansion to have something like a Holy Paladin, a Resto Shaman, a Discipline Priest, and a Resto Druid. 2 Resto Shamans, 1 Holy Paladin, and 1 Resto Druid. Usually, whenever you wanted to have one healer left that had no DR, Restoration Druid seemed to be the one that came out on top. Very high mobility, they have the ability to heal on the move extremely well, very strong cooldown for AoE healing, for throughput, like Tranquility. So in raids, they've always been, the fourth best, but still managed to sneak in. This might or might not also be thanks to their popularity in Mythic Plus, which we will see in a while. When we look at their current situation in Castle Natria, the current situation is the reason why even my own guild's Restoration Druid is trying to reroll hastily to Holy Paladin. Currently, Restoration Druid is 5th and at the lowest participation he has ever had. And as a complete opposite, Restoration Shaman is at the absolute highest. Now, I mentioned the popularity in raid remaining very high because it might or might not have been thanks to Mythic Plus. This is where we hit a sour note, because Mythic Plus has honestly been grotesque when it comes to healers. Because yes, Protection has become very, very popular in BFA at the end. We have had Beast Mastery Hunter become very popular. Even Rogues and Havoc Demon Hunters, actually, they have had a lot of dominance in BFA. But none of them have remained as popular for as long as a Resto Druid. So Season 1 of BFA starts, and Resto Druid from the start is already the more popular. The following seasons, in 10 to 14, which is the biggest chunk of the player base, Druid remains the more popular throughout the 2 years, basically, of the expansion and all the seasons. The bigger problem is the more we go up, the worse it becomes. Season 1 of BFA 15 and up, as you saw from the raids, Mistweaver was very popular, so they are still popular here, but then in Season 2, massive drop of Mistweaver and Druid is dominating at 40%. Season 3, it becomes grotesque at 39%, and then the last season, it tones down a little bit, but it is still clearly the more used and more popular. Now, the real abomination comes in when we go in 20 and up, so the absolute highest keys. 61% of healers in Season 2 in BOD were Resto Druids. In Season 3, in Eternal Palace, 54% were Resto Druids. And then in Season 4, with the OP scaling of corruptions of Holy Paladin, Druid lost a little bit. But it was still, regardless of that, still the more popular spec for healers. This is even more impactful when we compare it to the current year, to the current day. We see that at the start of Shadowlands, people were still tentative on Resto Shaman. They knew it was good, but they were still defaulting to Resto Druid, right? Look at this, 28% over the 25 of Resto Shaman. But then, quickly, people realized, oh shit, Resto Shaman is actually good, man. Why don't we do this instead? So Resto Druid lost more and more. Holy Paladin and Discipline Priest gained more and more, and so did Resto Shaman. So this is the first time in almost 3 years by this point that Resto Druid has been dethroned as the more popular Mythic Plus healer. This is why I mentioned the possible correlation with raids. The last expansion, Druid was also, despite still being less needed than a Holy Paladin, a Discipline Priest, and a Resto Shaman in raids, they still somehow managed to sneak in the 3rd to 4th most used slot as a healer, because they were 50 to 60% represented in Mythic Plus. Extremely popular. Now, their representation in Mythic Plus is dropping, is falling, and so is their raid representation. They have been tuned, I'm saying tuned, but I could say nerfed, to be more reliant on their mastery for their healing. Convoke the Spirits, while being a good covenant for Druid, is still better for DPS than it is for healers, and even then it is still a pure throughput HPS ability and not really bringing anything that would make them stand out from the rest of the healers, which is damage reduction, which is Devotion Aura, Barrier, even Spirit Shell, which isn't damage reduction but is damage absorption, and Spirit Link Totem. I do think they're still in a very nice spot for Mythic Plus. I do think eventually Restoration Shaman will get nerfed, because Shaman is not Druid, unfortunately, in the eyes of Blizzard. So Blizzard will let Restoration Druid be grotesquely dominating the entirety of Legion and BFA, but Restoration Shaman is bound to get nerfed after 2 months of popularity in Mythic Plus. I'm sorry, guys. So, when we look at all the specs, we can see that Balanced Druid has continued doing well in this expansion. Again, I would like to have some answers as to why, even when they don't seem to be doing that well, they maintain a popularity that isn't really explainable. Restoration Druid has been toned down a notch in Mythic Plus, mostly due to the strengthening of Restoration Shaman, and they have consequently dropped in popularity in raids. The two other specs that were more problematic for them in terms of usability, popularity, viability, were Guardian and Feral, and they are still on the low end, on the bottom end. Some signs of life for Guardian Druid, some more representation and some more popularity, particularly in Mythic Plus. There is still the question in raids at whether or not the popularity has to do with the fact that tank slots can be taken up by things like Vengeance or Warrior or Brewmaster purely because of the buffs and debuffs they bring, and the fact that their respective DPS specs aren't doing that well, meaning they are the only available ones in the raid to bring that buff or debuff, so you want them in, at the expense of a Guardian Druid, which isn't really bringing anything. And then a similar discussion can be said about Feral. Despite the damage of Feral getting much higher this expansion compared to what they had before, at least in raids, their popularity is still very low. They're still beating basically no other class. Every other class has 1 or 2 specs that do better than Feral, and even when you look melee for melee and range for ranged, they still only get better than Survival Hunter. So, let me know what you guys think about these specs, about how have they changed, if they've gotten worse this expansion for you, or if they've gotten better. What could be the possible saving grace for a Feral Druid, for example, even just on how to make them more wanted by the community, we can say, as well as unraveling the mystery as to why Balanced Druid has remained so popular. With this, we are done with our first set of classes. Druid was the first. The second one is going to be, I don't know. We will see. I don't know yet. So, see you guys soon. In the meantime, I'm sitting here enjoying the cries of Flavor of the Month Resto Druids seething.